Well, kind of anecdotally, a hell of a lot of people seem to get a flu every year.
What?
Oh my God.
Okay, I need to disinfect that microphone after we're done here. Look at this.
Okay, but look, guys. So Ben, how sad are you?
Well, the Israeli elections have just passed. The British elections were last year. I've got used to electoral disappointment in the last few months.
But what does it say that...
I went into the Israeli elections thinking this was not going to be a happy few days of my life politically.
Yeah, but I guess the difference is like Benny Gantz isn't a particularly inspiring candidate. Like it's sort of like it's bad that Bibi won, but it doesn't actually undermine the case for a compelling alternative, where I think that when you look here with Bernie underperforming on Super Tuesday against Biden, that seems to be that seems more sadness inducing potentially, because people believed in Bernie. People still do believe in Bernie, yet something doesn't seem to have gone right. Something went wrong. And it also says something about the Democratic electorate, that maybe the electorate isn't quite the way we thought they'd be or the way we want them to be. And we have to maybe question some of our assumptions about who these primary voters actually are.
So a couple of minutes before the exit poll in the UK last year, I caught myself thinking, well, what are people actually on the ground been saying versus people, in London or on Twitter been saying? And there was a huge split between people on the ground, both Labour Party kind of activists that I was talking to and journalists who were telling me it was going to be a wipeout. And the intellectuals, the strategists, the thinkers, the pundits that were going, and the polling experts who were going, it could be really close. In terms of what people have been telling me who've actually been on the ground in these primary states, they've been telling me two things. One is that Democratic voters are really scared, really want to beat Donald Trump, are extremely worried about children in cages on the border, the Supreme Court, corruption, crazy things happening on Twitter or to do with Ukraine, and that's their priority. And the second is Bernie's won the argument on healthcare. And I think whether or not what happened over the last few days is a Goldwater moment in a long road to a more left-wing Democratic Party or not, depends on how strong that second point is. Like, is it actually true that the population has been, in Democratic primaries, has been convinced that Medicare for all is the right answer? Certainly the polls I looked at today seem to back that up, in which Bernie was by far and away viewed as the better candidate on healthcare than Biden. One thing that I think I do feel a bit of sadness about is I think that there was an opportunity, if Bernie had done really well on Super Tuesday, to really dominate the conversation on foreign policy for the next few weeks and use this campaign as an opportunity to talk more about what could be different and what has gone wrong in America's $5.9 trillion war expenditure since 9/11. And now I think Bernie himself is going to tone that down probably.
Or maybe emphasize it because he has less to lose now. He might just go all out on certain issues that he's passionate about. But I guess we'll see. We should also...
I think he still has a chance. This is again the split between people on the ground and people who are kind of analysing from 10,000 feet. Journalists on the ground recovering it tell me it's not over. The electorate's very volatile. There could be another debate. Something could go terribly wrong for Biden. He's a uniquely weak candidate. People are unsure. There hasn't been a strong counterattack. Bernie can still pivot. The people at 10,000 feet appear to have been made up their mind quicker than the people there.
That's a good reminder. Our dear listeners might be confused as to what this British voice, this disembodied British voice is.
Yeah, welcome, Ben Judah.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Do you want to say some words about our wonderful guest?
Ben Judah, accomplished author, really one of the, I think, fair to say, most talented writers today, and which I think is also just magnified by the fact that, Ben, you're 29?
No, I'm a bit older than that now.
20, 30? How old are you?
I'm 31.
31? Oh my God. Still.
But I'm glad that my youthful looks are showing.
The thing is that Ben has
I've recently
written
got
so
into
many...
like sort of products and stuff to like fight off age. So,
well, he's already the author of two great books. Fragile Empire was your first book about Russia and Putin, and your second book, wonderful title, This is London, which presumably is about London.
Well, you could, you can't be really mistaken there. No, my first book was about the Russian system and trying to understand like how the Russian state works, told through kind of characters and journeys. Trying to emphasize, a bit before the curve that Russia was essentially a kind of fragile kleptocracy that needed, aggressive propaganda campaigns at home and activism abroad to sustain that regime. And This is London was a book about London, like seen through the eyes of immigrants, rich and poor, like trying to take inspiration not just from Orwell, but also from kind of Henry Mayhew and all these great kind of writers about London in that sort of British reportage technique of giving a voice to the people that are not often interviewed or profiled in The Guardian.
Yeah, you like talking to the masses, don't you, Ben? You like sitting with the people and hearing their views. Or not? Maybe you don't.
Well,
he's like actually.
Like, I really like like when I was like a teenager, I got really into like my fine art AS level, and for a while I did want to be a painter. Like for some years. Yeah. And it was just like, I think I was about like 17 and a half, and I'd covered rooms with these sort of canvases of these just total pastiche, early 1920s Viennese Egon Schiele misery faces. Oh. And I realized I just don't have the talent for this.
Did you save them all? Is there an archive of Ben Judah Egon Schiele paintings?
I gave them away to friends, actually. So they were good enough for friends to want them. So the gallery dispersed to like student dorms around London and the UK.
So there's like a bunch of them just scattered around with your old friends, and they probably forgot about them. But like in 10 or 20 years, actually, or 50 for that matter, people are going to be like, those are Ben Judah's paintings when he was young, when he was 17.
Well, yeah, but sort of. I stress they're not that good.
So before we just lose this thread, I want to go back to one thing, because I was talking to my mom on the phone on the way here, and she had just listened to the previous episode, which she enjoyed, and she says hi, Damir.
Oh, hello, Mom.
And but she was saying that I was a little bit sad yesterday. So I don't know when this will come out, but yesterday was the day after Super Tuesday, and my mom emphasized this because I've been doubting myself and wondering about like what all this means. And my mom was like, Trump's really going to like beat Biden. Like Biden doesn't have like a distinctive personality. Biden isn't a good speaker. And Trump is going to just dice him up in debates. And my mom, it was interesting that my mom is, I don't want to say she's like an ordinary voter, but she's someone she's not following this as closely as we are. I mean, she wasn't up on Super Tuesday waiting for the results to come in. So she's not really plugged into what, as you said, Ben, the 10,000 foot pundit level discourse is. And I think that it's a good reminder that there are a lot of people who are very skeptical that Biden can really effectively go head to head with Donald Trump.
She's Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And she's a Democrat.
Yeah.
And who would she have? Was she a Liz Warren voter?
No, I think she was vaguely sympathetic to Bernie in part because of you, because of me. But I think that But again, not someone who's very politicized. She knows about the different candidates, and she knows that I was friends with Pete in grad school and stuff like that. And we've talked about how that means that my mother wants me to run for president in 2024. And I'm not like, just Ben probably hasn't heard this. And my mom's not, she's half joking, but also half serious, because she's like, wait, Shadi, like if Pete can run, why can't you run? And
if people are married, why aren't you married? Same thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Anyway, but
right. So
I didn't actually know that you were friends with Pete in grad school.
oh, clearly you don't follow my Twitter, my long Twitter threads.
yeah,
I had a sort of like epic Pete Twitter thread. Yeah.
we turned into a podcast episode.
I'm really hurt, Ben. I'm really hurt.
I went off Twitter to like write my book for 2 months, and this is what I missed.
Blame it on the book.
And like
Classic.
now I'm like back, like getting 6 or 7 hours of screen time a day.
Oh wow.
Well, so
Okay.
anyway,
I'm not missing any of your tweets.
But go back to this this idea. I mean, there were a couple of things you said there about Bernie at the beginning, about the Goldwater moment, that maybe this is sort of setting the seeds for something for the future. And there's a lot to that, right? I mean, Ocasio-Cortez is coming up. There's a generation that's been sort of taught politics, under the Bernie campaign. So you might see it sort of flower in the future. But I don't know. Do either of you guys know about healthcare? Like Biden's not going to be Medicare for all. So, and is it? I guess the question I have for you is how important is healthcare? And this ties to my bigger question to both of you about Bernie is, about the question of the revolution, this sort of idea of just changing everything, and what you anchor that in. I know Shadi will quibble with me on this, but it's the one thing that jumped out at me with Bernie's sort of humbling and Super Tuesday is that this idea, this class-based idea, or this, let's call it the economic-based idea, it's not enough of a glue. I don't know, and if maybe we can talk about that and Corbynism as well, whether you see the parallel there.
Well, in terms of parallels between Corbyn's strategy and the Bernie strategy, these are very different politicians with different people around them, coming from very different places in the left, with pretty different views on world affairs that really shouldn't be too conflated, I don't think. But both had this vision that non-voters could be key to winning, and that non-voters would mean that they wouldn't have to persuade large chunks of conservative voters or moderate voters behind their ideas, and wouldn't have to make too many compromises. And that appears to have been where Bernie came unstuck on Super Tuesday as well. In terms of like problems that Corbyn also faced in the electorate, and the Labour Party faces in general, is that you have this incredibly stark age polarisation now in UK politics. Is that if a coronavirus catastrophe, Brezhnev that's not going to happen. But if it did, and the UK was only inhabited by a population aged under 30, the electoral maps are kind of absolutely stark.
Well,
you would be a completely red map. And even under 40, Labour would not have won the election, but been in a very strong position to form a coalition government. So clearly, the millennial left has a big problem, is there are just too many boomers.
Right.
And it needs to break off part of the boomers to advance, or it just needs to wait.
Old people are a problem.
Yeah, but again, indulge me here, right? Trump manages to do it. Boris manages to do it with a kind of right populism, if you will, right? And then what's the challenge for left populism?
It's about resources. It's like right populism is about like defending resources against others, and left populism is about redistributing resources. I think, rhetoric and tone, and, that's important, but I think the fundamental nature of those politics are different. Like something that I kind of realized when I covered the 2015 British election campaign for Politico, that world historical election, was that voters, especially in these kind of marginal seats, really think in terms of scarcity. They want to defend what they have, and that can shift quite easily from being Am I defending it from migrants? Am I defending it from the rich? Am I defending it from the Polish guy that's opened a shop on the street corner? And I think that's often a way of thinking that's left out of, shall we call it, left populist analysis.
No, go ahead, Shadi. I mean, well, okay, then let me, again, then this is something...
the form is not the most important thing. Like the substance is very different from right populism.
Of course, but, there's any movement requires you to gather people. And Shadi, your piece in American Affairs talks about, how a left populism might be able to do this, right? But again, correct me if I misread or misremember, but the idea was that sort of traditional leftist categories like class, like inequality, like these sorts of grievances could be almost totemically channeled to create a movement that would then go against the other to a certain extent, right? That was the thrust of it. And so when I was saying that the maybe the lesson of at least this cycle, and again, it might be this a Goldwater election, it'll bear fruit later, but at least the election of this cycle is that these categories are not strong enough. They're not strong enough. And it's to your point about scarcity versus sharing, if you will. You can maybe mobilize grievances, economic grievances, class grievances, however you want to call it, if the the hurt is big enough that people are willing to take a gamble. I would say that the hurt's not big enough. And this gets back to my question on healthcare. How important is healthcare? Even if he in polls won the Medicare for all, Biden's not going to get Medicare for all. Biden's going to get in bed with the insurance companies, and you're going to get Obamacare Plus or Obamacare on life support.
Just to kind of make a point here, that I don't think that the rise of the millennial left in Anglo countries over the last few years has been a failure. The left had ceased to be an insurgent and deeply challenging political movement outside of academia in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And politically, the left has ceased to exist as a viable political force in Germany. It has politically ceased to exist as a force at all in France and in Italy and in Central Europe. And the fact that now we're talking about a populist left candidate that still could be the Democratic nominee and had a disappointing Super Tuesday, and we're talking about Jeremy Corbyn, who was leader of the Labour Party, shows that something has shifted. And I think in terms of Biden and healthcare, so Biden, I don't expect very much of it, or from a Biden administration, full stop. Biden is, at least on paper, I'm not sure he knows he is, committed to a public option of some kind.
Yeah.
And I think that shows the success of these populist left tactics and of just building an online funding infrastructure, of building an online army, and just being committed to politics. And I think it means now being committed to the long slog.
Yeah, so I'll say, a couple of things. I mean, so as you mentioned, Damir, I wrote this article for American Affairs outlining what a new left populism could look like in theory and in practice. And I'm a little bit of an odd situation in the sense that no one would mistake me for a socialist. I don't have particularly strong or well-developed views on economics. I'm flexible, though. I'm ideologically flexible, and I find critiques of billionaires and corporations to be compelling, not necessarily in policy terms, but more so in moral terms and ethical terms. And so one of the arguments I make in this piece is that class critiques and economic critiques aren't necessarily a means to improve material outcomes. We have to move away from this idea that material and economic outcomes are determinative, that they're the number one issue. Because I don't think people are fundamentally driven by narrow economic interests. People care about identity, culture, and the who they are questions. We care about who we are more than we care about what policy is best for our economic interests. So when we talk about developing a left populism, we have to find a way to channel class arguments and class critiques for something that goes beyond the narrowly material. In other words, how do we use those critiques to build solidarity, to give people a sense of meaning, to rally the base, to improve morale and to create to build an ethical and moral framework for how we operate in political life. So for me, that's what was really appealing about Bernie. So when people say, well, Shadi, do you feel strongly about Medicare for all, or do you believe in putting the marginal tax rate to 50% or 60% or whatever? That to me is missing the point. And this is also what bothered me about people who were very excited about Elizabeth Warren. I have a lot of respect for Elizabeth Warren, but this focus on who has the best plans. That here's Elizabeth Warren, and she's putting up all these detailed plans on her website. And I'm like, that's not what politics is about. Politics is not, to me, fundamentally about policy. It's not fundamentally about legislation. And that's where I think the populist ethos diverges from the Marxist ethos and also the center-left ethos. Because if you talk to center-left folks, like the supporters of Mayor Pete or even Mayor Pete himself, they're fundamentally talking about how you can use politics to improve people's lives in this very narrow sense. Of course, we want to improve people's lives. No one would argue with that. But they think about politics in this very narrow sense of how do we improve policy outcomes? How do we use the technocratic apparatus of government to pass somewhat better legislation? But to me, that's missing the point. Well, let me just stop there because I've said a lot there.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think I get it. It's the question still is. I mean, I would say that Ben, you would say that it's happening in any case. So this mobilizing is.
Well, I just want to say how much I agree with that and how persuasive I found your essay. And I was, until the UK election, probably a Warren and then a Bernie supporter in terms of the primary. And then after the UK election, I just ripped Warren off my kind of wish list. And the reason is in the British election, the Labour Party presented a manifesto by think tank design, cobbling together all of the best work that people like me, with think tank fellowships have been able to put together in the Westminster bubble over the last 5 or 6 years. And it was exactly as you described, a impressive agenda to narrowly improve people's lives by 3.5 to 4.2%. And when this manifesto went into battle against Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings with the slogan, "Get Brexit done," it was a policy prescription meets an identity battle. And I don't need to tell you which one won. It really it was driven home to me what a mistake it is to retreat from the politics of ethics and emotion and identity and priorities. When I saw a friend of mine who had voted for Boris Johnson, much to my surprise, in a pub just after the election, and I went to him, "Well, why did you vote? Why did you vote Tory?" And he went, "Oh, well, I couldn't really understand what was in Labour's manifesto. The only policy that jumped out at me, and this was backed up by coverage data. This was the one policy that got a lot of airtime in British news, was free government provided state Wi-Fi for all." And he went, "That's just not my priority. It only costs $14.99 a month. I'm really worried about Brexit. I just want somebody to sort it out." And I realized after that conversation that everything that attracted me to the Warren manifesto, the corporate boards, the industrial policy, was not going to make it in the primary because it was a giant American version of free state-provided Wi-Fi for all.
That's really interesting because that goes against the conventional narrative that Bernie is the American equivalent of Corbyn. And you're sort of suggesting here that Warren had quite a bit in common with the Labour manifesto and with what was associated with Corbyn, which was the party manifesto.
Well, yes. It's like the Labour manifesto in the previous election in 2017 was actually a pretty moderate document, like very You know, it was like renationalise the railways, which is actually something the British government is in process of doing bit by bit, because it's being forced by circumstances to do anyway. And that slimmed down manifesto was much more popular with the public because it focused on priorities of nationalisation. The manifesto that was built for the 2019 general election, I believe, was the Warren manifesto in the UK. And in terms of like Bernie and Corbyn personally, like two politicians, I think it is unfair to both of them to say that they are sort of transatlantic twins. Firstly, the problem and the positive about Corbyn, this is an intensely curious man. He's very interested in foreign affairs, in the popular unrest in Irian Jaya, but he doesn't and has never really had the brain power to digest or carry through that interest in foreign affairs. And the result is this kind of garbled, constant commentary on foreign affairs. Bernie Sanders is not a foreign affairs obsessive. And he reminds me far more of these early 20th century European politicians like Leon Blum or like Adler that had priorities. And Bernie's priority of Medicare for all, M4A all day, every day, I think has been a transformative campaign for Democratic Party politics. And I think that even in a Biden government, the politics that he's inspired and the politicians that he's inspired will continue to hold the Democratic Party establishment to account because they've got that prioritization. Like, I don't really know where the Warren manifesto goes from here. I think it dissipates like the Corbyn manifesto in 2019 back into the think tanks from whence it came.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that Bernie is not a doctrinaire socialist. And in that sense, Bernie isn't as ideological as people think he is. So obviously Americans, anyone who's vaguely left seems very ideological from an American perspective. But this is where Bernie is more of a left populist. Left populism is less about policy and specifics, and it's more about a style of doing politics. And I think that's important to note because when people, the label socialist that Bernie continued to use for himself and still does continue to use for himself, I think has distracted people because people think that means that Bernie has socialist policies, but it's more, and Ezra Klein made this point on Twitter and maybe elsewhere, that Bernie is a socialist in ethos, in his kind of ethical framework, which goes to what I was saying earlier. Yeah. It's a sensibility, and people shouldn't misread what the socialist label really means.
So let me just untangle two things, because Ben, I think your point's right that if what we're talking about is, say, shifting the Overton window on something like healthcare, I mean, I would argue that it had been shifting already, given the sad state. I mean, even the fact that Obama managed to get Obamacare through, and then all the trials and tribulation of that created an opportunity, in fact, for Bernie to do what he's doing. But that's different from this idea of both Shadi's idea of left populism, which is this ethical, this mode of mobilization that's tied into these values. And, you know, yes, Bernie may have shifted the Overton window, and maybe now we have a very different discussion on healthcare, but that's different from, again, this idea of left populism and this generational change. I want to push you both on that, because I still think, and again, fully taking on your point that this man still might make it, might beat Biden because of who knows what happens in Michigan, who knows what happens in the debates. But again, I'm curious whether you think that this glue that you were, the symbols that you were saying, this ethical stuff that you were saying is going to mobilize. At least for me, looking at Super Tuesday, I didn't see it working. That on the merits of your argument, class, inequality, all the rest of that was swamped by a hatred of Trump and a feeling of electability, as you said at the beginning, as we started talking. How strong is this as a glue, do you guys think?
A fear of Trump as well, especially in minority communities in the US. And I think doing that's been talked about as much as needs to be at 10,000 feet. Like in the British context, like where is the debate on left populism now? Like the diagnosis going on inside the populist left factions of the Labour Party is that they failed to bring in a national dimension to their ethical story and to their campaign, and that hit a wall of resistance and incomprehension and a deep folk feeling that the welfare state is about a national community. And a lot of people in the populist left of the Labour Party have been looking with envy to how Sinn Féin has been tearing up the political landscape in Ireland, because it manages to combine a populist left ethical framework
with nationalism, though.
Yes.
Which is maybe the sweet spot in a way.
Well, I don't know. Let's talk about that.
Well, so Labour has the problem that the Labour Party has right now is, where does it go? Like, what is its national symbolism when, with the rise of a separate Scottish political identity and culture, Labour's been entrenched sort of, dominant party of government now in Wales since devolution. How does an Englishness that has emerged that the right has cultivated for years and been seen to be very associated with, how does that clip into a Labour narrative? And interestingly, Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's very much the sort of Corbyn machine's favoured candidate to take over, has attempted to craft a narrative around this, and it's fallen flat on its face because it has come across as if she's sort of picking historical moments like that sort of Salford Dockers went on strike to support Abraham Lincoln and attempting to invest them with historical memory and meaning, which is impossible if people don't remember them.
Right.
So I think, let me put something out there. I think that there's two different emotions that are at play here. One is fear and one is anger. And I can't claim credit for this idea, but I'm on this group chat with a mutual friend of ours, Samuel Kimbriel, who's does work in political philosophy. And I don't know who exactly said this on the group chat because their number just shows up. I don't know who they are. But anyway, this like mystery person on our group chat made a really interesting point that the sense of crisis that we're in paradoxically can lead to two mutually opposed outcomes. It can contribute to the rise of someone like Bernie Sanders because in crisis, you're going to have people who in the throes of anger and frustration will look for a more radical and revolutionary candidate. But the sense of fear and crisis can also lead to a kind of conservatism, a small c conservatism, where you say, we are in a state of crisis. Let's not ask for too much. Let's not go for revolution. Let's get rid of the proximate cause of crisis, which from their perspective is Donald Trump. So these voters will say, let's just get rid of Donald Trump and just try to have some calm and quiet and stability. And then we can worry about revolution a little bit later on once we remove the existential threat. So the current moment that we're in contributes to both the rise of Bernie Sanders and the rise of Joe Biden, but for different reasons. How does that sound?
That's a very compelling, yeah.
But again, my counter, it's not a counter to that frame, but my counter to left populism then is, again, it comes back to it. The crisis is, or at least the inequality crisis is not big enough to actually create a revolutionary thing. In the sense, when Bernie talks about revolution, there's a kind of reality here that revolution at the ballot box is kind of a stupid idea, right? Like a revolution is extra institutional often. So it's basically if people are calm enough to vote, I'm still making the case to you guys both that we're not at a point where all of these categories that should be for a left populist to succeed, coalescing people, they're not there yet. I mean, that is the lesson that maybe not.
I'd push back on that. Like, is very popular at the moment to criticize aesthetic socialism. Oh, all you want to do is have like rose emojis on your Twitter profile and like tweet things in sort of like funky Soviet constructivist fonts, and you're not really a social democrat or a socialist. It's very popular to like blame a sort of rude behavior, the sort of Chapo style, and it's very common. There's a whole class of punditry that's truly transatlantic, which is about sort of elder men sort of tutting at younger sort of women and men for their political choices. And looking at what's happening in the UK and in the US, I feel very thankful that we have this movement that's attempting to do the most normie thing possible, which is revive, you know, in the UK, like just over 100 years old, and in the US, much older, political party.
Right.
You know, if you look at Europe, like and the events that have been happening over the last few days on the Greek border have like deeply kind of shocked and upset me, with the Commission's like full embrace of like Urbanistic iconography and attitude and willingness to suspend basic human rights of refugees and migrants in Thrace. And that's been able to happen because of the PASOKification of all the major European social democratic parties.
Right.
Nobody went into the French Socialist Party with this agenda and attempted to revive it. You know, people I'm also a French citizen, but like it would be, you know, we would be so lucky, us French citizens, if there was a problem as bad as Super Tuesday and Bernie's performance, or Corbyn having revived the Labour Party in terms of membership.
And this is why it's outrageous that the Democratic Party establishment, look, I respect Democratic outcomes, and Biden did better on Super Tuesday. So there's no like rigging. There isn't a conspiracy there. Biden won more voters on Super Tuesday. And if he continues doing that going forward, then yeah, he'll be the nominee, and we have to accept that. But before Super Tuesday, there was this sense of these Democratic Party elders and establishment figures, essentially, as you said, Ben, tutting the very young, enthusiastic supporters of Bernie and saying, oh, look how angry they are, look how bad they are, whatever it might be. And I'm like, here's a party that doesn't know that it has a very strong asset here, that there's a group of people who are excited about politics. And you have this older generation of, quite frankly, boring establishment figures who don't understand what it means to excite voters and what it means to actually introduce new ideas that are inspiring.
Yeah,
for a party to sort of self-sabotage in that way and to try to diminish a whole wing of their party because they're just lame, I find it remarkable.
No, but they want Obama to basically package up neoliberalism with like really nice rhetoric, and that's the lesson they learned. That's how, because again, I mean, that's true nominally in what you say, but there's interest to be involved, and in fact, like every large donor to the Democratic Party soiled their pants at Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders'
so let's be straight
tax
up about
proposals.
it, that these people are prioritizing their economic interests, and they would rather the party be moribund and boring and lame rather than having a real dynamic party that speaks to something bigger. They just don't want that. That's not their interest.
Well, they want to win, and they want to like actually do well by winning. I mean, that's really what it is.
They don't have a great record of winning. So here's the thing: when people say, "Well, moderates have a better chance of winning," I look at the record, and to me, it's a record of failure. I look at 2004 with John Kerry. I look at 2016. Are we forgetting 2016 with Hillary Clinton? With 2000 with Al Gore? Like, it's not a great record.
But they look to Bill Clinton and they look to Obama and they say these were two-term 8-year presidents who embraced, big business, centrism, however you want it. And Obama, more even than Clinton, though they were both real talents at this, were able to do this sort of reaching to people's stuff. And I that's the.
But this is revisionism because Obama ran in 2008 not as the centrist candidate. He was competing against the centrist candidate, or what was perceived to be the more center-left candidate, Hillary Clinton, and he was mobilizing a new generation of self-identifying progressives who thought that Obama was going to push on this. We found out that he was more of a centrist, but I remember because I became more involved in Democratic politics and more excited than ever about Democratic politics in 2007 and 2008 because of Barack Obama. A lot of us thought that he was offering something distinctive and new that was counter to the traditionalism of Hillary Clinton and the broader Clinton establishment. And to kind of recast Obama as a centrist, yeah, he became that, but that's not what we thought he was.
Well, so one thought I have, which makes me still optimistic about, and it's unusual for me to be an optimist in a podcast or a conversation, but I'm enjoying it this evening, is the coalition that Bernie has brought together of millennials and black and white and Latinos of all ages very much is the future of the Democratic Party in terms of makeup, and the coalition of African-American voters and older white voters that Joe Biden has is, that is going to be a smaller share of Democratic primary voters going forward over the rest of our lives. And I think a lot of US kind of politics right now, and the way I try and sketch out the pivotal events over the next, 10, 15 years, will depend on how profoundly the country changes when we pass the demographic tipping point in Texas. And if Texas becomes a blue state, there's a very different path open to the presidency, which will be very appealing to run through via a populist left or post-populist left sort of agenda.
Well, what do you make of this racial divide? So this is interesting that
Hispanics versus blacks.
Well, I wasn't quite saying that, but this idea, and maybe that's.
I mean, that was the interesting thing about Super Tuesday, that Bernie took Hispanics and Joe Biden took African Americans.
But I think it's also that,
but not those under 30.
Right.
Yeah, so with black voters under 30, that's where Bernie has a lot of traction. But for some reason, black voters who are like over 35 or 40, that's where Bernie
was fear. This is a community that's got so much to lose and has suffered so much structural racism, and I completely understand. And
so why wouldn't? But I
understand and respect their choice. That ultimately, at its most profound level, politics is about every few years the country comes together and we decide who is going to protect us. And we have to be honest that Bernie didn't speak to Bernie didn't speak to African Americans in a way that they felt that he was going to be able to protect them and defend them against the dangers of another Trump presidency or creeping kind of white nationalism and Republican governance. I think that
because they thought that Bernie had less of a chance of winning. What did Bernie fail to convey to voters who were fearful in that regard?
I think it's just that. I think they were frightened that he wouldn't be able to win, and I think that they were scared that this could be a kind of this could be another disaster for the Democratic Party. And I think the campaign has taken that on board.
But there's also some polling that suggests that black voters writ large are just generally more conservative. They're less left, they're less liberal in quotation marks, and even on moral and social issues as well.
That's true.
So I think there's something interesting going on here that in some sense white voters, especially educated elite white voters, at least some of them, when that goes for both supporters of Bernie and supporters of Warren, are more progressive in certain ways.
Well, I do think that one area where the campaign appears to have pivoted is, moving into ads heavily featuring Obama and the campaign's already trying to present a more kind of inclusive image and expand the tent than where it was kind of 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I think it's something that we're going to be discussing for a long time.
Can we talk about one other thing you mentioned at the beginning, Ben? I just want to get back to it. It's the foreign policy thing, and you were saying that that Bernie sort of opened up an ability to sort of talk about some things, and depending on even if there is more legs to the campaign, you'll still be able to sort of maybe even. Are we talking about shifting the Overton window on some of these things? How do you think about that? You want to say a few words?
One of the most important things about any political campaign is even if you're not sure you're going to win, you need to use it as a marketing campaign for your ideas and to get them, being seen with national attention. And I think the fact that the Bernie campaign's foreign policy wanted to highlight a different approach, firstly from the classical left approach, which has this great weakness of not being interested in developing an anti-authoritarian message or strategy of its own, and then also deeply questioning the Obama foreign policy establishment's record and certain kind of key issues in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia or Israel-Palestine. I think that's been a hugely positive contribution to the national debate, and I want to see more of that. I want to see where that goes.
Just wanted, before you jump in, Shadi, because I think you two have a lot to talk about. It'd be really interesting. But to highlight, you've written 2 pieces for The Guardian recently, basically about some of these issues, Ben.
Thank you, yeah.
With your colleague
David Adler.
Yeah. Both good articles. We'll put them in the show notes for people to read. But go ahead, Shadi. What were you going to say?
Yeah. So, and I like so Ben and David's article on what would a progressive foreign politics look like, and maybe you can say more about what that means to say not progressive foreign policy, but progressive foreign politics. And one of Ben's arguments, I think, is that we shouldn't have this separation between domestic and foreign policy, that if there's a broader progressive vision, that it's connected and intertwined, and we have to bring it together. And I think that that's a really important contribution to the debate. And I think Israel-Palestine speaks to this, that I don't think Israel-Palestine is the central issue. I think that it's become reduced in importance over time. That said, why it's important for symbolic reasons and for ethical and moral reasons, because if you have a strong position in favor of Palestinian rights, it's a proxy for your broader foreign policy. And when I see a candidate who's willing to go out on a limb and say potentially, and not just potentially, actually controversial things, criticizing Israel and even talking about things that a major candidate never talked about before, which is making aid to Israel conditional. That used to be a third rail. And now the fact that Bernie is actually willing to go there and talk about this relationship in a critical way, it speaks to the fact that Bernie Sanders has a set of moral commitments. And if you're willing to kind of go against the grain and going against the elite bipartisan foreign policy consensus, it says that you're willing to also go against the elite consensus on authoritarian allies, on Saudi Arabia, on Egypt, and saying, hey, we're not going to do business as usual with these problematic authoritarian allies anymore. We're going to completely revamp these relationships, and Saudi Arabia will no longer be a close ally. It will no longer be a linchpin of our broader Middle East strategy. So for me, there's an ethical framework that connects these different topics, opposing the Yemen war, which is incredibly important. And the list goes on. So I think that's what we have to start building. Do we have a commitment to American values abroad? And that's what we have to be speaking to. But please, Ben.
I agree. One of the things that I found very interesting developing in these articles is trying to question the very kind of concept of foreign policy. And if you sort of go back, and there are some very good journal articles on this that we can maybe put in the show notes to try and work out where does the concept of foreign policy, as distinct from foreign politics or politics that takes place abroad, come from. It's very clear that it was a strategy to insulate the hand of the crown in 18th century England to give it an exclusive domain to act abroad in the name of the national interest. And really our critique of foreign policy as a concept begins with this concept of there being a unitary national interest. And like clearly, and the coronavirus is a perfect example of this, is there a unitary American national interest that unites the drug companies' interests on this matter, normal American citizens' interests on this matter? Absolutely not. Like the drug companies that are currently trying to push up prices or profit out of these events kind of internationally, or the drug companies that have sought to increase the costs of healthcare and medical access around the world are not aligned with the interests of your average American citizen when it comes to global healthcare and global disease prevention. So that's the first concept we've tried to kind of really, really unpack. And the concept of the national interest has always been clearly, through American history, whose national interest? An interest has been a stand-in for the interests of elites, of sort of moneyed and powered elites. And like our second concept is that, you know, in a hyper-connected 21st century technological society, it's really sort of impossible to draw clear lines between issues that are exclusively domestic and issues that are exclusively foreign. And we need to think of any attempt to kind of fix one issue. Let's take, for example, just look at your computer there, like fixing issues to do with internet governance. That's going to be impossible to do without a global campaign, a global coalition with like progressive forces and allies, and pressure within international institutions to create a functioning, an improved internet as one aspect of the global commons. And a lot of the work I've done on kleptocracy really sort of unites this together. If you want to look at, you know, one of the concepts we've developed is that American sort of thinking often suffers from what we call a passport problem. And it is the idea that there's an American hedge fund or a major American bank has an American passport and acts in the American national interest, even when it deals with Russia. But when we look at the transnational infrastructure of global illicit finance, well, whose side was Deutsche Bank really on when it was dealing with with laundering the Russian elite's finances and full knowledge of the political consequences of that, both for Russia and Western democracies? We need to think beyond that. And what really attracts me to the Bernie agenda has been this infrastructural approach of trying to focus on the global infrastructure of finance or climate and energy in order to achieve a better global commons.
And that's something you and I have talked about this, because on the one hand, I think rhetorically, especially on the left, I think this is one of those places where it's easy to dismiss a lot of this stuff because you talk about solidarity and like finding, kindred movements around and leveraging that. But the real reality, and you're alluding to it now when talking about kleptocracy and the international system, is that ultimately you need the United States leading on all of these issues to actually achieve anything, to actually shape the environment where you can even envision kindred forces rising up. Because this is
my great fear about the Biden administration. Like, I think that Biden can win. I think that Biden's shown that he can bring out turnout. I think he's a competitive candidate. I know he's going to have a lot of money behind him.
Of course.
But my fear, and we were sort of both joking about this on Twitter the other day, is that Biden could be a sort of American Brezhnev, or perhaps more accurately, an American Chernenko, a sort of senile, a sort of elderly caretaker administration whose pitch to the party establishment was that he wouldn't do any difficult, radical economic reforms that would make life disruptive for them or undermine their power, and wouldn't challenge an overextended, hegemonic and interventionist foreign policy.
He'll be the placeholder placebo president. And maybe that's okay for a couple of years. I guess some people are okay with it. But if our theory of the case is that the failures of the Obama era contributed to the rise of Trump, that Trump is a symptom of a broader set of structural problems and not the cause, then if we're returning to the status quo ante, if we're returning to normalcy, normalcy is what helped Trump become Trump and become our president. So if we're returning to normalcy, are we at risk of repeating the same cycle and the same set of mistakes that lead to the rise of right-wing populism or contribute to the continuity of right-wing populism? And that's my fear. And that's why a lot of this comes down to what our fundamental starting premises are. Why are we where we are? Is Trump an aberration, or does he represent something deeper? If he represents something deeper, then we have to address those deeper issues. And I don't have much confidence that Biden can or wants to or is willing to address those deeper issues. And that's my real fear, that we might have a period of, I don't even think it will be a period of relative calm, because if Trump will still be around kind of raising hell and being controversial and all of that and creating this sense of grievance, what we know is that even when you have a centrist president, Republicans don't, just be quiet and comfortable. Oh, we're going to work with Biden. We're going to work across the aisle. No, they're not going to do that.
Right. So
there's still going to be polarization. There's still going to be anger. And that's going to be fomented for another 4 years. So we're naive. Democrats and liberals, we get naive about this when we think we have a unifying president like Biden who seems unifying. But what we find out is that the polarization continues.
Well, so,
I couldn't agree more with that. Yeah. And I'm very much in agreement with you on the Trump being a symptom of the status quo, not a non-aberration to the status quo. And this brings me back to a lot of the potential of the Bernie movement and why, almost regardless of can it win this nomination, I still think it could. There is a chance if something spectacular happens over the next few days. They're really maybe there are 3 issues here that sort of draw me to that. The first is, what I think Annie Lowrey wrote a piece the other day talking about the great American affordability crisis and how despite 10 years of economic boom, we have a situation where 140 million Americans are living through healthcare related financial hardship, that 1 in 5 Americans can't pay their bills at the end of the month. And there's been this price inflation there. If you believe, like I do, that that's a key driver of populist discontent, I don't see Biden being able to deal with that. If you want to look at the second category, which is the racism theory of Trump, that Trump represents a sort of some dark force and strain of, right-wing nationalism in the country, I don't really know how else that can be confronted apart from with a growing, dynamic, aggressive, anti-racist movement. I don't really think we have a choice about that. And the third issue, which for me is very important, and is the context in which all of this is taking place, is climate change. I'm personally of the belief that climate change is going to start having over the next 5 to 10 years a similar effect on the world order as a major war. And I think we have a taste of that with how the coronavirus is already disrupting our fragile system. And I don't think we really have a choice apart from to continue to kind of push, an aggressive agenda-setting movement on that issue, which I don't really think Biden understands.
Yeah, and that's why I should say that the contributing causes that are leading to the rise of right and left-wing populism, the anger, the fear, the outrage, the sense that something is going fundamentally wrong, we're still relatively stable in America. What I really worry about, what you're alluding to, Ben, is that 10, 20 years going forward, these structural causes are going to get even worse. And I really worry about what that's going to look like. I know Damir is keeping time.
Well, no. I mean, given that we're coming out on time here, I have one question for the both of you, which I think maybe takes us out in a tidy way.
Yeah.
Here. There was a tweet that I think actually, did you share this? No, or Ben Haddad actually shared it with us earlier today. It was by some guy called Mike Racine. I don't know. And he says, "No offense, but some of you warned people need to get over it. When Bernie lost in 2016, we didn't cry this much. We sucked it up and voted for Trump." Was the tweet.
Yeah,
it's a great tweet. But the question is this. You said 4 years, stasis, maybe not so bad. Give me a prediction how, let's say Biden wins, Bernie goes down. Ocasio-Cortez, the perhaps the figurehead of the movement, even though she won't be president in 4 years. She's still too young. What's the strategy you think now? Given everything you just said, Shadi, is that Republicans are not going to be playing ball with the centrist unifying Biden. That's nonsense. Of course not. So what's the strategy for the movement? Do they back Biden for 4 years of stasis, or do they heighten the contradictions?
Well, I think that, if it's Biden versus Trump.
No, Biden wins.
Oh, okay.
Are you heightening the contradictions for 4 years?
Well, that's what's going to happen inevitably, that if 4 years of Biden means that the fundamental issues aren't being addressed and they're just merely postponed until some later date. So to use the phrasing, the contradictions will be heightened. That said, if Biden loses, which I think is actually, I don't want to say it's very likely, and God help me, as critical as I am of Biden, I don't want another 4 years of Trump, and I can't deal with it because it's exhausting. And I really hope, if Biden is the nominee, that he will win. That said, I worry about his ability to beat Trump for reasons that we mentioned earlier. And I think that the only silver lining of Biden losing to Trump, the only thing that I think it could help lead people to is an understanding that centrism or center-leftism is not a sure bet. People always see that as the safe option. If we want to win an election, let's not rock the boat. Let's go with the reliable center-left candidate. If Biden loses, it will, I hope, and I hope it doesn't come to this, but I hope if that happens, people will finally realize it's not a safe bet. And that's not the way to go if you want to beat someone like Trump. So I think either way, there's going to be a set of realizations. And I think that, look, we're in this for the long haul. Me and Ben, we have a theory of the case that isn't about 4-year electoral cycles. We're looking forward because we want to build something bigger. And this is where someone like AOC, I think, is actually like an amazing combination of different things. She brings a lot of the Bernie class critiques, but she's also a more flexible, dynamic candidate who is nimble and can bring more people into the tent. And I think that AOC is really the promise of a kind of, an unusually dynamic left populism.
Ben, again, Biden wins. What's the strategy?
Well, the first strategy is just don't stop. Don't stop building, advancing, trying to, think about the long march through the institutions, do what you can to broaden that cultural and ethical project. In terms of free tips towards future campaigns, I think that there is a consensus that then there needs to be a little bit of a course correction away from the coarser part of Bernie Twitter towards the AOC online demeanor, full of a sort of radical love and embracing of different sort of centrist camps or left-wing camps like the Warren people. I think that, and this is a problem that I actually don't really know. There's no quick ameliorative strategy that you can do online about it. Is I think that the left on both sides of the Atlantic has to develop an old people strategy. How to just break off more of that vote.
But also a Big Ten strategy that you have. We need a left populism that welcomes center left folks and says, hey, we maybe don't agree on everything. We have policy differences, but here's an inspiring candidate. And again, I'm thinking about AOC here. You don't agree with her on everything, but she's a unifying candidate and she wants to make space for people who are, quote unquote, maybe more closely tied to the Democratic establishment. I don't know if we can win if we're always fighting. At some point, we have to say, yes, we will fight against what is worth fighting against, but we will also welcome people. And I know that's hard, and that's going to be a difficult balancing act. And we have to know who we don't necessarily want to welcome. And we probably don't want to welcome the former CEO of Goldman Sachs or ex-billionaire or whatever it might be.
There's your problem. There's your key problem, but go on.
Yeah, but I think that AOC...
Given that they're the constituency, but
the AOC ethos, I think, offers some of that promise. It's not going to... And we have to be creative and we have to be somewhat flexible. Like I consider myself to be an ideologically flexible person. I'm heterodox. I'm not particularly rigid when it comes to a particular discourse against billionaires. Should we have some of that? Yes. But should we also know how and when to pivot to bring more people into our movement? I think we have to find creative ways of doing that.
Gentlemen, any final words?
But
Ben?
I think that the course correction that needs to be done in terms of presentation and like coalition building, I think that's the easy part. The difficult part, I think, is trying to break off 35% of the old vote and bringing them into a kind of necessary election winning coalition. And that I don't have any immediate answers for.
All right, gentlemen, let's go have some dinner.
Okay. Thanks, Damir.
Bye-bye.